Good morning. It's Monday morning. We are on Acts 17. We're going to read verses 1 through 4. Now, when they had passed, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessaloniki, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. So, Paul and Silas leave Philippi and go to Thessalonica, where Paul later writes the 2 letters to the Thessalonians. Thessalonica, we call it in English, or Thessaloniki, and I think in Greek, but it's a city in Greece, and that's where they go. And there's a synagogue there. And here what we see is what Paul typically does. It's rehearsed over and over in Acts. He goes to the synagogue, and I imagine he says, "Well, I'm a visiting rabbi from Jerusalem." And they go, "Ooh, okay." And he kind of tells them his credentials, and then he begins to teach them about the coming of the Messiah, which Jews would be very interested in, and says this Jesus was the Messiah. And some of them believe him, and some don't. But, 2 or 3 Sabbaths he rehearses this and goes over it with them. And so by the end, some of the Jews and some of the devout Greeks, who would be among the God-fearers, we call them, and some of the women go with Paul and Silas, and they want to hear more. Now, we stopped there because the rest of the Jews are going to have a problem with what they're saying, but we'll get to that tomorrow. So this is Paul's strategy. He goes where he's got an audience. That's the synagogue, and he stands up and he teaches them what he knows about Jesus. So in our day, if somebody arrived in town and they were a Presbyterian pastor, say, and they would go to the Presbyterian church and say, "Well, I'm a Presbyterian pastor and I bring news from the General Assembly," we would all be interested in hearing what that news was. And we might even give this fellow a chance to teach us something. And I can't think of a parallel to announcing the Christ, but that's the way that these Paul's news would get passed. And remember, it's obvious to us perhaps that, in those days there was no electricity, there was no kind of media, there was no way to transmit this message except word of mouth in person, so or letters, I guess. But if you don't know the people, then it's hard to write them a letter. So he shows up and says, "Hey, I got some news. Let me tell you what happened." And some of the people hear it. Now, for us, that I think the parallel might be for us is look around and see where do you have a kind of a built-in audience? Because everybody has a story, and everybody has a history. So say whatever you did in your career. You were a nurse, you were a school teacher, you were a business executive. You've got these communities that you meet with occasionally, perhaps, a group of retired teachers that goes out for lunch, or executives who meet, or some club that meets, or even your golfing buddies. You've got these people that and you can say to them, like Paul said, "Hey, let me tell you the story about Jesus." Now, if you do that these days, a lot of people are going to go, "I don't want to hear that stuff. I heard a lot of it in church, for years and years." It's almost, someone said that contemporary church has been inoculated against the gospel. We've heard just enough of it to not be too interested in it. But that's a different problem. But you see the strategy that we could use. It's the same one that Paul used. Paul went to the synagogue because that's where he had some credentials and would be heard. So we would go somewhere else, perhaps, and tell the message of God's grace in Jesus Christ. Well, so that's where we are today. Go out and tell that message, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day.